My mother went to Florida, and she started working in Florida as a chiropractor. And she met my father there in New Smyrna Beach, and they married, and his name was Albert Henry Moeller, and they had an old homestead, which is now the national park. My mother came up to Indiana because my grandfather had a stroke, and I was born in Columbia City, Indiana, and I went back to Florida. My father also had a fishing camp at Turtle Mound, and he had a store in town, and at the store, my mother worked in the store, and it was right near the railroad yards, and I would sneak out. I was probably about 3 or 4. I would sneak out and go over to the railroad yards because I was interested in trains. Why, I don't know at this time yet, but it was mechanical, and I was interested, and they'd bring me back. And probably the next day I was back over there again. And then we went down to live at the camp because the Depression was coming on pretty strong, and we lost the house in New Smyrna. My father lost the house, and he lost his fleet of shrimp boats that he had, and he also lost land just outside of Miami, which is now Coral Gables. And my father had a lot of people that came from the Carolinas and such down to the fishing camp. And I can remember some of the early things was we had a rooster that was always attacking me every time I get out in the yard. And one of the things that I do remember was that when I was good, my father would let me shoot the shotgun, but I'd back up against the wall with the butt of the gun against the wall so I wouldn't be taking the shock of the recoil. And I remember throwing nets out to catch the fish, and that was in the river. And I can remember boats going up the river and down the river, and so every now and then at low tide they would run aground, and so my father would have to come out and tell them how to get off of the reef that they ran into, and that was part of the life. I came back up to Columbia City because my grandfather had another stroke, and the mother came up to take care of him, and I started school at Columbia City grade school and went all the way through to high school there. I probably did not have a normal family. I had grandparents that I was living with all through, from starting at school from 5 years on up.
Why is that?
Because my father came north and it snowed, and he said he'd never go back. He liked Florida so well, and he had his fishing camp and all of his friends down there, and so we'd go down. I'd go down every couple of years and visit him, and his sister, 2 sisters, Aunt Mary and Aunt Amelia.
Were you and your father close at all?
Yeah, pretty close.
But you didn't see him very often.
No, I saw him maybe every couple of years, and I knew that he liked fishing and such, and I enjoyed it when I'd go down and fish and such, and I'd fished up till I left down there 5 years old, and I knew that he had been through hard times with the Depression, that he lost all of his holdings basically, and he was making the best out of it. And he told me that during the war they sort of assigned him to watch the coast, and he did see Germans come ashore from a submarine down there. But when he saw that, why, he hid behind the sand dunes. because he knew if they found him, why they would probably kill him, and they counted on him being a sort of a caretaker of that area, because when we first went down there, I can remember that the roads were just sand down to across the river. There was one bridge across from New Smyrna over to the riverside, and then down to camp, down to Turtle Mound. And down there, the scrub palmetto was quite high, and my father always carried a gun, because once in a while he'd have to shoot a snake or a water moccasin or something like that.
What became of your father?
He passed away from a heart attack. He was in the hospital and walking down the hallway and died. He'd gone to the hospital and just passed away. And
how old were you?
Gosh. Oh, I was probably 30, something like that.
Yeah. And what's your mother? What became of her?
She died of a stroke. She died in her 60s, and he died in his 70s. And everybody said that I would die young. And here I am, still going.
What do you attribute that to?
I don't know. Just taking care of myself, and we always ate right, and we always lived right, exercised right. I was always involved in something. In Indiana, as I was growing up, I can remember as a kid, I was always dragging things to my grandparents' house. We lived there, and I'd be bringing a big tree limb home. But then once I got it home, I'd have to get rid of it, and so I was always doing something like that. And I can remember getting ice off the back of the ice truck, because we had a refrigerator or an ice box on the back porch in those days. And it had a big wood stove. And I got a dog, and I called him Clipper, because that was the time of the China Clipper airplane. So I named him Clipper. And he was a little Manchester Terrier. And he would chase cars, but he wouldn't chase them in the street. He would chase them on the grass between the sidewalk and the street. And of course, the cars would know this, and they'd start blowing their horn as they were coming and get him all set to run down the road. While I was in high school, I met a pilot who was flying at the different villages, taking people up. And so I went to town to get fuel for him, because we landed in some alfalfa field at some farm near the different towns. And so I would take my wagon and go in and get fuel, and also pass out handbills stating to come out and see your city from the air. And he would let me fly back home at night when we came back, and that's how I got interested in the airplanes.
Do you remember the name of this pilot?
Chance, Harold Chance was his name. He had a Piper at the time, and I'd met a lot of other pilots. He wasn't the only one that would operate out of a field there. And one of the pilots ended up, I can remember, he had an old Lincoln airplane. On Lake WWII, he took off and hit a crack in the ice level and tore the landing gear off, and went skidding on the rest of the way across the lake and up between the cottages.
So this is a dangerous operation here. What did your mother think of you being involved in it?
Well, she never said anything about it. I'm sure she was quite worried. I wanted to play football, and the coaches wanted me to play football, but she wouldn't sign the papers, because she figured that was too dangerous. So I played in some of the basketball leagues there in high school, and baseball. But as I say, I was more interested in tinkering with cars, and finally I bought an old Lincoln Zephyr, and I was always taking it apart, and a friend of mine and I would go out and buy old cars, and we found out that in the spring, after the hay mows were empty on the farms, there would be always an old car that the farmer had given up on and had parked in the hay mow and covered it up with the hay. But by the spring, it was uncovered, so we could buy it for $15, which was about the only amount of money that we had. And I started out on the paper route. And finally, I figured I wasn't making enough there, so I had two paper routes. I had a paper route before school and a paper route after school. And as time went on, I decided I could do better, and so I went to work for the Kroger store. So I'd go into the Kroger store in the morning before school and help unload the semis, and I'd go back at night and help clean up, and also sack groceries. And on the weekends, I remember carrying groceries out for the people in paper sacks. And I'm quite concerned nowadays about them taking the plastic bags away and going back to paper bags, because the paper was always torn, and I'd be halfway to a car a block from the store, and the groceries were falling out on the street. And I'd have to stop and pick them up and put them in my pocket and carry them over to the people's cars and such.
So where do you think all this industriousness came from?
I have no idea. I just never wanted to sit around and do nothing. And school really wasn't active enough for me, because I never took any books home from school, but I did go and buy a spelling book so that I wouldn't have to carry a book home. And I'd study that and I'd get 100 on the spelling, but 2 weeks from there I couldn't remember how to spell what I'd studied on. But math was one of my leading subjects, science was, and anything that was associated with life, basically history, were some of my fancier, likable courses. The day I graduated from high school, I got aboard a train and went to the Navy boot camp. The reason I ended up at the boot camp, because in December of '43, I'd gone to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and taken a test for the Naval Air Corps because I wanted to fly airplanes. And I got 100 on the test, so I was written up in the Fort Wayne paper and in the Columbia City paper and everywhere. This was strictly luck, because of quite a few of the questions I had to guess at. And so I got very disgusted, because I tried several times to get into the Naval Air Corps, and they always said that I had a heart murmur, so they wouldn't accept me. And so I enlisted. And as I say, I got aboard the train the day after I graduated from high school and went to Williamsburg, Virginia, to the CB camp, because Great Lakes was filled up at the time. And this was in the early '44. Well, on the train was D-Day as I was going down there. And at the boot camp, unbeknownst to me, I got selected from the test that I took there to go to V-12, which was the training school for officers for the Navy. And so I sat out all the summer there until October and went to Newberry College in Newberry, South Carolina. which was a Lutheran church college. And we went through 3 semesters there, and then the government decided to close the program down. And so the engineering went over, and why I decided engineering, I don't know, but I did because I like to tinker with things so much. And so we went over to Georgia Tech. And at Georgia Tech I had two semesters, although the second semester at Georgia Tech I ended up in the Naval Hospital at Charleston. And there I had a tooth that was growing in the roof of my mouth the wrong direction, and I had that taken out down there at the Naval Hospital, but I got back before the program was canceled in 46.
I want to stop a minute and back up, okay? You're in high school. The war has started, 42,
Yep.
43.
Yep,
You knew you were going to graduate and probably go off to war, right?
yep.
How did that feel? What did your friends think? What were you saying to each other? Were you scared? Were you excited? What was that like?
No, I was not scared. I figured that I wanted to go in the Navy, where a lot of my friends, a lot of them had even quit their senior year, halfway through the senior year, to go to the Army. And some of those were killed, and which was saddening. But on the other hand, I was still anxious to get in the service. And naturally, I wanted in the Naval Air Corps, but it ended up that I found out later on that a lot of the people that got into the Air Corps at that time were either discharged or put back over into V-12 in the college program. So I guess I was taking the right track, but this was strictly happenstance. I had not planned it this way. But then when the program was closed in 46, I came up to Purdue. All my friends that got their commissions, when I got mine, they all ended up out at sea.
Oh. But isn't that what you wanted? Did you want to go out to sea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to have spent some time on a ship. The time I spent was on the Lexington CV-32 aircraft carrier one summer, which was a training cruise. And I got into some trouble there.
Tell me about it.
I'd gone over to one of the recreation place attached to the base, and I met some people over there, and I met a lady, a girl, and she gave me her phone number. And I said, well, someday we'll be going up to St. John's, because that's where the Lexington's going, is going up to not St. John's, but to a city near there on this cruise. And so she gave me her phone number. So when I got up there, I called her up, and she got I got a buddy, and who had gone to in the program with me down at Purdue, and she got one of her friends. And they came over and picked us up and took us all over Newfoundland and showed us all the sights. But we were late getting back, and they had waited for us. The two of us were the last, and so the head lieutenant or whoever it was, or in the Navy, they chewed us out for not being there on time, but we got back to the base, and he said, "You come and see me when we get back and get aboard ship." And so my buddy and I had to go down and see him, so we explained that we hurried to get back, but we'd been out so far, and so he let us go. But we thought that, boy, he could really fix us up, because we weren't there when we were supposed to be.
And that was the worst trouble you ever got in?
That's the worst one that I figured it could end up bad.
You
But
were
it
a
didn't.
choir boy.
So, no, well, he could see what I was doing there on the late and because I was always moving ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
I moved too far ahead, close. They assigned me to the 20 millimeter just below the flight deck down on the mezzanine like. And the target plane was towing the target by, and the first guy, he froze on the gun. He didn't do anything. There was three of us assigned to it, one to load and one to help out and the other one to shoot. So he didn't, so they said, okay, you take the next time the target plane goes by. So I took it, and the target plane came, and it's the sight moves by the fact that how fast you move the gun, it moves and gives you the lead. And so I came in fast, and so I was way ahead of it, of the target. And I could see that I was too far ahead, so I was watching the tracers going out instead of the target because it wasn't working for me. And the guy that was supervising us all, the naval guy, he was up on the deck above, and he was yelling, stop, stop. Well, I just shot the whole cartridge case clear out, and I said, quick, load, the other guy, load again so I can shoot some more. And well, he said, you almost shot the damn tail off of that tow plane. You were so far ahead.
Did you have any aspirations beyond the military? I mean, did you think about,
No,
I'm going to go to war, but I don't know what else.
Not that far ahead. Most of everything that I got involved in was by happenstance. At least I think so. But because nobody was directing me, I wanted to be in the service, I wanted to do this or that, and I ended up by enlisting because I couldn't get into the Naval Air Corps, and I got into V-12 by the fact that they decided to put me there. Went through college at the expense of the government, and then when the program was canceled, I came up to Purdue. And I went by the Naval Armory to see what they had there just out of curiosity. And they talked me into re-enlisting, so I was only out of the Navy 2 months, from June until August.
You were still in school. You were at Newberry, then you were at Georgia Tech, and the war ends.
Yeah.
Were you relieved? Were you disappointed?
Yes, I was disappointed because the program ended and I wanted to get my commission, but it just didn't happen at that time. So it happened though when I re-enlisted at Purdue, and they made me take 2 more semesters because they didn't, some of the credits from Georgia Tech they wouldn't accept. And I can remember, and they made me do the drafting course again, and I put the finish marks on the drawings, and they told me that I wasn't supposed to do it that way. I was supposed to put an F there, and I told them they didn't know what the hell was going on in industry, and they said, "Well, you're at Purdue and you're going to do it Purdue way." But when the course was over, the instructor apologized to me and said that he went out into industry and did find out what I was doing was correct. Because how do you know what kind of finish to put on a part if you don't put it on the drawing? And so these things, I always arguing with people, not arguing with them, trying to help them out to get up to date on what was going on in the world. And a lot of them wouldn't listen because they were set in their ways, too set, and I was not. I was drifting through life, but in the right direction. When we graduated from Purdue in 48, I had met my wife. She was a roommate at Purdue to a good friend of the family's. My mother's friend, his daughter, was going there, and she was her roommate. So that's how I met her. And she liked to dance, and I enjoyed dancing, so we met that way, and I took her out quite a bit. And she would tell me, though, that she was going to she wanted to marry somebody that traveled a lot, and that I probably wouldn't. I'd be too stationary. Not realizing later on that we traveled a tremendous lot all over the world. I was very disappointed at when the graduation came and I got my commission, and all the other people that were in the same course at the Naval Armory there got their commissions. They all went to sea, and I had been suggested by one of the instructors there, who had been a captain on a destroyer. He felt that I would be an excellent person to be on a destroyer. But then I started looking around, and I interviewed down at Aero Products in Dayton, Ohio, Vandalia, Ohio. It was a General Motors plant making aircraft propellers, and I got the job. At Purdue, I got out in February, and in March we got married. And
Tell me about the marriage. What did your families think of that?
well, they didn't object. In fact, they came to the wedding, and the wedding was at the University of Chicago in their chapel. And C and I, for our honeymoon, we traveled all around and ended up in Mammoth Cave, and went through the Mammoth Cave, and went through a lot of different historic places through Kentucky and such, and back up to Indiana. She wasn't demanding. She enjoyed traveling, and of course I was always trying something new, and that was involved traveling, and so I take her with me quite a bit. She never complained about the traveling and about being alone. She would run the household while I was out working, and naturally, just like any wife has to do. And when I would go overseas or such and didn't take her, why, she would run the household quite well, and without complaining. She figured that I would take her on the next trip. So that's how it worked out. Oh, we had difficulties at times. I can remember once I was down somewhere in town in the car, and she wanted to go someplace, and if I didn't take her, she was going to get out. So I said, hell no. So I speeded up and headed back home. Let her get out at home. And then Dave was born in December.
Tell me about finding out you were going to be a father. How'd you feel about that?
Oh, about 2 months after we was married, two of us went on a honeymoon, and the start of 3 came home. And that was sort of fast, but that's the way it was.
Were you excited about it? Were you apprehensive about it? How did you feel?
Well, yes, and I remember getting ready to take her to the hospital there, and I slipped and fell down and hurt my back on the edge of the bed. But I got her out in the car and got her to the hospital. Dave was born in Vandalia, or down in Dayton, Ohio, at the hospital. And the ladies at the church would take him to the doctor because C hadn't learned to drive yet, and I was working there at Aero Products. And I say, as I say, I left Aero Products in 59. 59, because I could see that it was going to be the propeller business.
Wait a minute. I don't want to talk about the propeller business. We're talking about a brand new baby. We'll get to that.
Well,
we're still in 1949.
Yeah.
Okay? So David is born, all right? Now, I heard a story that you kept him in a drawer or something like that.
What?
You were so poor that he slept in a drawer? Is that true? And that somebody came and said he's got to have a crib?
No, he cried so much because he was injured when he was born. Being a breech birth, they yanked him out, and which tore the muscles in his neck. And so I would pick up the crib and set it over in the other room from the bedroom. There in the we lived in a ex-military barracks. There were 4 apartments to a building, and they had been taken over by the village, Vandalia, and were leased out. And of course, we had no furniture, had no money, just starting business and such, and that's why we ended up in these barracks that had furniture, but it wasn't the world's best, and it had a big old coal stove in there. And I finally bought a kerosene stove and put the coal stove out into the coal bin, which was outside and out back. And during that period also, I was getting bored at work. It wasn't enough. And I was traveling around, and I saw a guy out in the field working, digging a trench, and I stopped and asked him what he was doing, and he was getting ready to build his house. And I asked him if I helped him build his, would he help me build a house? And he said he'd check, and later on he came back and said yes. And so we built his house one summer while I was there at Aero Products. And we built mine the next summer, and then the next summer we joined 3 other people who were doing the same thing, and the 5 of us built 2 houses in one summer.
So tell me how this worked, because you had to go through permitting and all that stuff, or was it different then? You could just pick a piece of land and build a house. How did that work? I mean, it's a hard thing to do to build a house. There's a lot of things, a lot of steps involved. You didn't have any experience, so tell me about how you learned about this.
Oh, I just figured it out. Since I was handy at figuring things out, I could look at something and see how it should be done. And so we fit right in, and we built the one house, and we built the next house, and it just went on. He worked at Wright Field, and he quit there and went into house building full time after we built the 2 houses with the 5 of us.
So were these prefab houses? Were you following a plan? Where did the plan come from?
No, I drew the plans. In fact, I even drew plans for other houses to keep busy. So I was involved in 7 houses. Well, we were there and lived in these rental homes there in Vandalia. The Chevy dealership was just less than a block away. It was right along the side of the Platte. And David, I'd ask him one day where he had been, because he had grease all over him. And he said he'd been over to Moeller Chevrolet. And he had also, if he was missing and I'd go hunt for him, I could hear voices coming up out of the drainage sewer. And I'd look down there, and he was leading a whole group of kids, and they were crawling up through the sewer. and finally I have to tell them, turn around and go back the other way and get out of the sewer. It was always something like that. And a lot of times I would take him to work with me, especially because I was going over there at nights. And at one time I was over there, was laying bricks for and blocks for the chimney on this one house of the two houses that we were building, because we were doing all of our work after normal day work. So we would put in roughly 4 hours from 6 to 10 on house building every day. I'd take Dave down there when we were in Vandalia. We'd get a blanket and put out in the yard, in the courtyard sort of, and at night, and go out there and sit and look at the stars, and I'd name all the stars off for him and show him the different functions of the stars. And on the weekends, C would make lunch, and we'd come out and they'd go back in the field behind the houses where we were building and have our lunch with the families and such as things like that. So we went through life that way. I wasn't with him 100% of the time, but when I was with him, I remember when I was back to laying the blocks, a cat came by. And so we took the cat home. It was stray, and it was named Taxi Bell. We named it Taxi Bell. And see, we brought it back to the apartment, and she said, "Where in the world did you get that?" And I said, "Well, we're at the house. We brought it home." And Dave and I brought it home. He was still little. And so that's how we started getting cats. And the cat would venture down the way to other apartments, and the family down there fed it, and so half the time it was there at their house, and the other half of the time it was at our house.
So are you saying that when you brought the cat home first, C wasn't happy about it?
Well, she felt the apartment wasn't quite big enough to handle a cat, but it worked out.
Well, didn't you have a commitment to the Navy at that point? Didn't you have to go into the Navy for a while? They paid for your education.
No, I was in the Navy. I got my commission, and the reason that I wasn't called to sea, I later found out that my records in the Navy were not in BUPERS, Bureau of Personnel. They had been moved over to the Guggenheim estate, which was a research division of the Navy. And that was the reason that everybody else went to sea, and I didn't.
Why do you think that is?
Evidently, according to my grades and the tests that I had taken, like I said, the Air Force Naval Air Corps test, I got 100% on, and everybody wrote that up, saying that I was a brilliant person, and most of it was luck. I imagine that the same thing happened at boot camp and then that test. That's why they selected me to go to officers training school. So that's why I sat out there instead of going to sea as a seaman in the Navy. I sat out and went up to Newberry. I stayed in the Navy until 1958 in the Navy Reserve, and I would sign up to go to a tour, a 2-week tour at a naval base, and of course I signed up. I wanted to go to Vandenberg for the missiles, and I wanted to go to Patuxent Naval Air Station for the airplanes, and I never could get there because always something occurred at work at Aero Products. Of course, they were making the propellers for all the Grumman aircraft for the Navy, as well as other airplanes, and so I never ended up going to gain my points that I should get. Although I took courses all the time, but I couldn't get enough points to keep my level up. And that didn't occur though until 1958, when I got a letter from the Navy that says you're behind on your points and you're not in line with the Annapolis graduates. And so either get your points up or get out. And I figured, well, I've been in it 14 years, so I signed I'd get out, and that was the fastest I ever saw them write records. And so I was discharged. But
so all through like Korea and everything else, you were working in industry.
yes,
And it was determined that you were working an important job in industry,
yes,
so there was no need for you to leave and go to active duty. Is that
right.
okay? How do you think your life would have been different if you had gotten into the Naval Air Corps?
Oh, I've been flying naval planes. One of the kid who had never expect to be a pilot, that was a year ahead of me in school, got in the Naval Air Corps. He was commandeered to fly out to meet some admirals that were flying in to protect them from the Japanese over in the Pacific. It was the group of the Pacific that flew the Corsairs.
I am struck by the fact that a lot of the Apollo astronauts are guys who are about your age, from the Midwest. The Neil Armstrongs and the John Glenns and
Yeah.
those guys are your contemporaries, and you have a lot in common with them. Do you ever think about that? Do you think that perhaps maybe you might have gone in that direction?
Well, sort of, but I watched how they build the satellites and stuff. I got involved in that, and I was involved in the supersonic airplanes with North American, and I knew a lot of people in all the aviation industry, Douglas, North American, and Boeing, and Lockheed. I was quite active in the Lockheed Electras. We had the props on those, and we had the props on a Convair plane on a 580. So I just grew with the industry, and the guys that were picked for or got into space, I didn't know them personally, but I knew the groups. And I sort of felt maybe I would like to have done it, but I thought, geez, I'm having such a good time doing what I'm doing, so just quit worrying about it. So then we left there and came up to Kalamazoo to National Water Lift and spent 10 years there in Kalamazoo. And by that time, she learned how to drive and such, and I got her a car. And usually I was buying Buicks. I would have a bigger Buick and have a lesser Buick for her to drive. And when she was still learning though, back down there in Vandalia, and she ran into a ditch and tore the right front wheel off the car, and had to take it over to Moeller and get it fixed.
So you're in Kalamazoo now.
Yeah, so I got up to Kalamazoo.
So something important happened in Kalamazoo.
What?
Something important happened in Kalamazoo.
Oh, it was there. I was working on the tanks and on aircraft as well.
I wasn't talking about that. I was talking about your daughter.
Well, we had Stephanie was born in Kalamazoo.
So let me ask you a question. Stephanie was a surprise, right? You didn't think you were going to have any more
Right.
children. So tell me about finding out about Stephanie.
Well, we found out that she was pregnant. She was. It must have been that German water that we'd been drinking that caused that. And she was born there. I took her down to the hospital once, and the doctor sent her back home. And we were sitting at the kitchen table, and she said, "I gotta go." And I said, "No, not going to go right now. We'll have supper." And finally she said, "I got to go. If you don't take me, I'll have to go get the neighbor." And Dave said, "Well, if you wait one more month, I'll be 16 and I'll be able to drive and I'll take you." And but I took her down there, and Steph was born in 45 minutes.
So you're a guy, you're getting closer to 40. You have a son who's in high school.
Yes.
He's going to be off to college in a couple years. And all of a sudden you're starting all over again with a daughter.
Right.
What was that like?
Oh, it was great. And she was an enjoyment. And Dave would take care of her too, carry her around. And he was quite happy that he had a sister, because all of his friends were in big families, and he was all by himself. And but I can remember Steph, her biggest desire was to water the chipmunk holes. So she was in the summer, she was out with the hose was running all summer long, and flooding out the chipmunks, and she'd take a quart milk bottle and put over the top. After she put the water in the hole, and the chipmunk would come out and get up in the bottle, and so she'd bring it in and show me. So she was bringing chipmunks in the house. And she grew up there and went to school there in Kalamazoo. Started there.
So that's from the mid 60s into the early 70s, as
Right.
Stephanie is growing up.
Yeah.
And so what happened that caused you to leave Michigan?
Oh, I got tired of National Water Lift. I figured that it was time to go try something else. And I went over to Stryker. They wanted me to come over and help design hospital beds and different things, Dr. Homer Stryker. So I was 2 years there. And Lee Stryker, Dr. Stryker's son, he was quite a wild guy. But they had an airplane, and I go flying with him, but I didn't really like the way he really didn't know what he was doing most of the time, flying. And also he was chasing women all the time, and his wife finally sued him for divorce. And he asked me one day what I thought of him, and I told him, "Well, you're okay now, but we'll have to wait a while to determine what I think of you." And he didn't like that, so I was fired. Within a month I was gone. And so later on I had a machine shop down at Schoolcraft, which was about 10 miles south of town towards Three Rivers, Michigan. And I had a partner in that, George Barnhart, so we called it Barmo Manufacturing Company. And we did quite well. We moved along pretty good, but I got sort of tired of that because I was doing most of the design work on stuff and going out and getting business, and George was running the shop. He had been a machinist all his life, and I can remember I'd go down on the weekends and clean the place up, and I'd take Steph along, and she would go with me a lot of times. And so I decided that wasn't for me after a while, so I left them. And so on Wall Street Journal an ad for rollway bearing in Syracuse, New York. It came over in late December, so I worked here through the winter because Steph was still in school, and we didn't want to move the family over until school was out in June. And I had them over on some of the weekends, and we looked for houses and picked the house that we're living in, that I live in now. And I picked it because I looked at about 4 or 5 houses. I looked at down at Baldwinsville on the river. Dick Semele was the builder, built a house down there, but it sold the day before I got there. But so he said, well, he's got us a bunch of houses up in Cicero. And so I went up there and looked, and we looked at all up and down the street. He'd built a bunch of houses on that street, and Steph liked the one house, and she went over and sat on the front porch of the 4-column house, and so we ended up buying that house.
So Stephanie picked your house?
Right. Steph had picked the house. We worked 2 years designing a factory in Romania, and being that I'd been in Europe before and enjoyed working over in Europe, that's part of the reason why I came to Syracuse to go to Europe to build a factory in Romania. And
so tell us about the unique experience of working and living in Romania.
It was it was starting out from nothing. Of course, I learned their system, but they would let me go anywhere. They gave me a visa that I could go in and out of the country whenever I wanted, and we settled in an apartment in Bucharest, and the plant was built in Ploiești, which was about 40 miles up the road. Ploiești was the center of the oil industry that was bombed during the World War II by the Germans. And we stayed in Bucharest because I put Steph in the American school that was sponsored by the U.S. Embassy there, and she was in the 7th and 8th grades there, and it was only went to the 8th grade though. And so when she finished the 8th grade, I put her in boarding school over in Salzburg, Austria. And so she had the 9th and 10th grades there in Austria. We went, on the weekends, we traveled all around. We went up to Dracula's castle and such, and we traveled all over Romania, went down to the Black Sea quite often in the summertime, and we stayed down there for half a week one time. Since it was a communist country, they always knew where we were, and they told me, the people at the factory, of course, that I had assigned, and I had a secretary and such, and they said, well, we know where you are all the time. And even along the road, the 40 miles, each corner, when I'd go by, the guy would be on his little radio telling the next guy that I was coming. He'd be watching for me to make sure I was going by. And I'd wave at all of them, and once in a while I'd stop and talk to them. And so they all got to know me quite well.
Did they consider you a threat? Why did they so closely monitor your coming and going?
No, it was required by their law that they knew where I was. But I would go wherever I wanted, and they'd always say, yeah, we heard you were coming. And
yeah, but tell me about the people who were living in a police state and what the general feeling of the place was?
Well, most of them were glad to see me, and I would haul them around. But if I took them in my car, I had to pick them up away from the plant, and when I take them to their house in Bucharest, I had to let them out a couple blocks away from their house, so that the neighbors would not see that they were traveling with a foreigner. And then so we got the system down pretty good, and I got an extra car for C. She volunteered over the school and volunteered one day, and from then on, she stayed from then on, teaching art and crafts and things like that. And so she had a car to drive back and forth from the apartment, and we were on the 7th floor. Now and then they always knew when I got aboard the elevator, and they always carried extra cigarettes. I didn't smoke myself, but I always had cigarettes, and I was bringing in cases of cigarettes. And so when it came in, I would open it up and give a carton of cigarettes to the military or the communist head there. I just lay it on his desk, and of course he knew that that way I had pretty much free access. I was buying my way with cigarettes, and the family's way, and we were invited to their homes quite often, and so I invited them to our apartment. And the apartment had a store on the first floor, and of course a lot of the Romanians there in Bucharest would, before they went to work, would come over to the store and get liquor, and they sit on the outside of the building there on a ledge and get drunk. And I had the same problem at work. A lot of the workers would show up inebriated, so we'd have to let them sit around and dry out before I'd let them back on a machine. So that was just the way it was. So C, even though I remembered back in college she was going to marry some other guy because she didn't want to, she wanted to be traveling all the time. Well, she had more experience in traveling than she'd ever imagined. After the plant was built, came back to Syracuse, and I could see Rollaway was heading for disaster, and I told the comptroller, asked me if I knew who he was, and I said no, and he said, well, he had been the comptroller of McCrory Dime Store. Well, McCrory Dime Store went bankrupt years ago. So I didn't say anything though, but finally I wrote a letter to Fraser. I had 13 points in it. And the first point was, as much as you hate to do it, you're going to have to get rid of some of the people because we don't have the cash flow. I handed him the letter when he walked by my desk one day, and he opened it up and read it, and he says, "You're right, you're fired." So that was the second time I'd been fired. But I said, well, that's all right. You can't fire me because I quit 5 minutes ago. And went and got a box and packed up all my stuff and walked out the door. And incidentally, Rollaway Bearing went out of business about a couple of years later after that, like I said that they were going to do. But I looked around for a job and didn't find what I wanted. So I put my resume in with the city downtown, the government, and I was called up to Young and Franklin by Dudley, and he hired me as a salesman. So the first year I traveled all around, but trying to set up business, basically associated with the aviation business. And so I started designing some stuff and setting up, and told him that we had to also have an aviation name associated with Young and Franklin. So in '88, we went out and bought Tactera. Tactera had been nothing but a machine shop. So I set up production, I set up quality, I set up engineering, set up all the functions basically. And so Dudley never said anything to me. He would once in a while make a suggestion, but I do it the way I wanted to do it, and evidently it worked out good. And then we got so big that we started hiring people for the different jobs, and the head of quality and the head of production and the head of this and that. And I got the title of Vice President of Technology. And because he figured I wasn't going to stay, but I stayed until he had a great big party for me. I didn't know he was going to have it for me for my 90th birthday, and that same year, that was in June, and then in September the company, he sold the whole business as one unit.
So tell me about that. When did you find out this was coming, and what did you think?
Well, I was told right away by these people. They came in and they said, they had a meeting, and they said, you're not in the meeting. There's 3 of you are discharged because you're too old. I get invited back to the cookouts that they have for Young and Franklin, and also for Tactera, and so I go to both. And here I am, retired and trying to stay busy.
It sounds like that's the theme of your life, always trying to stay busy.
Well, yeah, you can't sit around and do nothing. You go nuts. I was married a month after I got out of college, and my wife passed away here just 4 years ago.
How difficult was it for her when she found out about her diagnosis and what it was doing to her?
Well, she wasn't exactly happy. The problem started, one of the neighbors said they saw her over at the bank, and she'd running up against a pole and she couldn't get the car away from it. So I better do something about it, because she was getting to the place where she couldn't drive too well and she might be getting a wreck. And so I sort of easily took the keys away from her and started hauling her around wherever she wanted to go as well, so that she wouldn't feel left out. And it wasn't an obligation. It was something that I just felt we'd been married and had a good marriage, a good life. So it slowly moved from being active over to that. I had a daycare center, St. Francis. I'd take her down there every morning and pick her up every night for 2 years, and then I put her into the one on Old Liverpool Road, and behind the assisted living there was a permanent housing for people back there. But she fell down, and they put her in the hospital, and the doctor wouldn't let me take her back there because said she couldn't walk that well. And so I took her down to on James Street, and I didn't want to. That was the closest place I could get I didn't really like it, but I put her in there. But fortunately, the first day, or first night that she'd been down there, they called up and said they had a place for me there at Idlewood. And so, boy, right away I took her up there. And that was fortunate because that's right across the street from Tactaire. And it was just part of the family. Every night I'd stop there after work and stay with her until her dinner was ready, and then I'd wheel her in to the cafeteria there or the lunchroom, and they'd feed her, and then, or I'd help if they were first. And then on the weekends I would go back and have my Saturday dinner there and Sunday dinner there. And a couple of years, and she commented, "Oh, they put me on the third floor, and that's where all the nuts are." And I said, "No, no, there's a lot of them up there. Are still very, very active and such." And they all commented that she would tell them where else she'd been on her cruises and things, and they'd talk to her about that, you know. And they said they really enjoyed talking with her and creating a life for her as well as them being interested in the subjects. It was ideal. I couldn't have found a better place. Dave was very intelligent. He could read. He was not a good reasoner, but he was very intelligent. He would read what he would read. He had it right now. You only have to read something once. Steph is a reasoner. She'll reason things out. She's that side. She's my side, and Dave was C's side.
What's the difference between raising a son and raising a daughter?
None. You had to take care of both of them. Some of these questions are difficult to answer because it's just straight life.
Yeah, yeah.
I
think what we're trying to get at though is how you felt about things. You know, I mean, like when Dave said, "I want to go be a doctor." How did you feel about that, and were you proud of him?
I felt that if that's what he wants, great, because I had him already accepted by the Navy for the Naval Officers Training School and accepted at Purdue. So what we had to do was tell Purdue he wouldn't be in the naval program, that he'd be in, that he wanted to be a doctor and be in that type of a program, and then tell the Navy that no, he's changed his mind, he wants to be this, and you don't want to wait for doctors, you don't support that program because it's too long. And so we got that straightened out, and he wanted to go to Purdue though, because he'd been down there visiting quite a bit. We'd go down, and then while he was there, C would go down and bring him home on weekends sometimes, and drive down, and a couple other kids around the area who were down there, they share rides.
He obviously he's been a great success. He's done very well for himself.
Yeah.
He made a nice life in Alaska. He hunts and fishes.
Yeah.
Did he?
He didn't hunt and fish much before.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. So where do you think his love of this came from?
Well, he called me up one day, and when he started out at Purdue for general college work, and then he went to the University of Michigan to medical school. Then he went to the University of Washington, Seattle, for his fellowship. And he called me up and said that he'd been approached by a group in Alaska, up at Anchorage. They wanted him to come up and interview to see whether they would want to hire him. And he said, well, he didn't really want to do that. He wanted to practice in Tacoma or Seattle. And I said, well, hell, Dave, that's the only frontier we got left. And if they said they were going to pay your way up, go up and look. And so he went up and they hired him. And of course, being in Alaska, hunting and fishing and outdoor activity is the norm. And he got into that. And I'd taken him fishing a couple times down in Kalamazoo and taught him how to fly cast and how to spin cast, and took him on the boat with a neighbor in one of the lakes, and the first thing he cast sideways instead of overhead, caught me in the ear, and had to get the pliers out and cut the barb off the hook to get it out of my dang ear. But I didn't complain. And that happened up in Alaska also. One time I was up there and we were fishing, and they caught me on the side of the head. I said, geez, you haven't learned yet. You got overhead instead of sideways. And but he started enjoying it, and he got a bear, a grizzly, and got all kinds of fish and such, and finally he bought the place down at sold out, and he calls that his camp, and the hell, that's a regular house. You didn't go down there?
Yes, we did. It's a pretty nice place.
You did, yeah. It's got all the conveniences of a regular home.
What's wrong with that?
Not a thing. That's not a camp. That's a home.
Well, that's great. He's got a home by the river. That's wonderful, isn't it?
So he's done quite well.
So Stephanie took a different career path. She wound up working for the federal government.
Yeah.
Tell me about how you feel about her career choice and if you're proud of her.
Well, she first was going to get a job with one of those transport companies. She didn't end up getting that, and she ended up going with the government. But she had gone to Phoenix for her master's degree, and the next thing I knew was she was signed up with the government. And it was all right by me.
Well, she had a very successful career there.
Yes, she did.
And
did
some of your friends or people you knew know anything about where she worked and ask you questions?
No, they just say, where does she work? And I said, with the CIA. And they said, oh, and that would be the end of it. Because most of them knew that we were pretty quiet. We could say CIA because they were saying that across the news, and that part was open. I never did know what all she did, because some of it was pretty classified. And but as long as she was happy and was doing good, and I knew she would do good. So it worked out. You both got to travel and see the world, part of it anyway.
So after a long, long time, you find out you're going to be a grandfather.
Yeah.
What did you think of that idea?
Well, I figured that sometime sooner or later you were going to have a family. And I couldn't quite understand why she was waiting so long. You probably couldn't either. But, well, it felt just like when I picked Dave up when he was little, tiny. And Steph, when she was a baby, carried him around. And he became a member of the family right away. He was just part of the family.
I noticed a couple times when you've gone to like Nate's basketball game or something, you'll say, "Go, Dave, go." And it makes me laugh that you're sort of maybe reliving some stuff from when Dave was a kid.
Yeah, yeah. It keeps you young. That's the advantage, I guess, of having grandchildren.
What advice would you give your grandson at his age, knowing what you know now? What would you tell a 14-year-old about what to look for in the future?
Well, you will have your thoughts about what you want. You probably haven't made up your mind exactly yet what you want, but get the most out of everything that you're involved in right now. And the things will happen. You all of a sudden will know. I tell most all the young people that I've known over the years, go to small colleges for the first couple of years. Don't spend big money going to a big college, even though I did, but I didn't have to spend the money. The government was spending the money for me. And go to that and get your English and history and all the other basics involved, but be sure to check to make sure that they are transferable to where you want to go. And once you decide what you want to do, transfer into the college that you think is the best. I've been very fortunate in my life that things always came. I didn't necessarily go hunt for them. Things just happened. It came towards me. And if it came towards me, I grabbed a hold of it and I'd hang on. I've just lived a general life, and it's always gone the way I wanted it to go. Or let's say it went, and then I appreciated it.